Somewhere in the middle of the Pacific Ocean, almost 2,000 miles from the nearest continent, hundreds of giant stone faces have been staring at the horizon for over 500 years. Nobody who built them left a manual. Nobody who carved them wrote down why. And for centuries, every expert who studied them walked away with more questions than answers. Then Elon Musk's AI, GROK, was pointed at Easter Island. It was fed satellite images, archaeological surveys, and the exact position of hundreds of statues. What it found didn't just add another theory to the pile. It exposed patterns that human researchers had missed for generations, patterns that link these silent giants to the land itself in ways nobody expected. Stick around, because by the end of this video, you will never look at these statues the same way again. Let's start with what we actually know, because the truth is stranger than most people realize. Easter Island is called Rapa Nui by the people who live there. It sits alone in the South Pacific, roughly 2,300 miles off the coast of Chile. It is one of the most isolated inhabited places on the planet. And somehow, on this tiny speck of volcanic rock, ancient Polynesian settlers created almost 1,000 massive stone statues. Nearly 900 of them have been documented by archaeologists. Most were carved from compressed volcanic ash at a quarry called Rano Raraku, where dozens of unfinished moai are still sitting, half-carved, into the cliff face, frozen in time. Some statues stand just over 3 feet tall. Others tower past 30 feet. The heaviest ones weigh more than 80 tons. That is heavier than a fully loaded semi-truck. Now here's the part that keeps historians up at night. These statues were carved using only stone tools. There were no metal chisels, no cranes, no wheels, and no draft animals on the island. And yet, roughly 280 of them were successfully moved from the inland quarry to ceremonial platforms along the coast, some of them miles away. For centuries, nobody could explain how a small island population pulled off something that would challenge modern engineers with all our current technology. If you're new here and you love unpacking mysteries that mainstream history barely touches, hit subscribe now, because we dig into stories exactly like this one every single week. The traditional explanation for why the Moai exist is actually pretty well established. Archaeologists generally agree that the statues represent deified ancestors. The Rapa Nui people call them Moai Aringa Ora, which translates to the living faces of our ancestors. It's believed that when an important chief or leader died, the statue captured a kind of spiritual energy called mana. That mana was thought to protect the community, ensure fertile harvests, and guard the clan's territory. This is why almost every Moai faces inland, watching over the villages rather than out to sea. They weren't just monuments, they were guardians, spiritually standing watch over the living descendants of the people they represented. But here's where things get murky. Why were certain statues placed exactly where they were placed? Why do some sit on elaborate stone platforms called ahu, positioned with a level of precision that seems almost deliberate? And why do some of these platforms line up suspiciously well with sunrise and sunset on specific days of the year? Researchers have documented several ahu, including Ahu Tongariki, Ahu Akivi, and Ahu Nau Nau, that appear to align with solar events. Some scientists have proposed these alignments were intentional, a way for the Rapa Nui to track solstices, equinoxes, and seasonal changes critical for planting and harvesting. Others push back, arguing the evidence is circumstantial and the alignments could be coincidental. For decades, this debate went nowhere, because comparing hundreds of statues, their orientations, their spacing, and their relationship to the landscape by hand is an overwhelming task, even for a well-funded research team. This is exactly the kind of problem artificial intelligence is built to solve, and that brings us to what GROK actually did. Instead of a small team manually cross-referencing a handful of statues, researchers used GROK to process satellite imagery, existing archaeological surveys, and positional data covering hundreds of moai across the entire island all at once. AI systems like this don't get tired. They don't lose focus after the 50th data point. They can compare thousands of measurements in the time it would take a human researcher to finish their morning coffee. And when GROK ran its analysis, it began surfacing relationships between the statues and the island's geography that had simply never been examined together in this way before. So what exactly did it find? According to the analysis, the placement of the moai isn't random, and it isn't purely about proximity to villages either. The AI identified patterns linking statue positioning to specific landscape features, things like elevation changes, freshwater sources, and natural sightlines across the island. In simpler terms, the statues appear to sit at points that create a kind of network across Rapa Nui, connecting resources, ceremonial sites, and astronomical markers into a single, interconnected system. If that holds up, it would mean the ancient Rapa Nui weren't just placing statues to honor the dead. They may have been building an entire functional map of their island's most critical resources, encoded into stone giants that also happen to serve a spiritual purpose. Think about that for a second. A civilization with no written language, as we typically understand it, no metal tools, and a population that likely never exceeded a few thousand people, may have engineered a system that tracked water, land, and sky simultaneously. That is not a simple monument building project. That is closer to sophisticated resource planning disguised as religious architecture. And it's the kind of insight that becomes visible only when you can process massive amounts of spatial data at once, which is precisely what the AI was able to do. Before we go further, if this kind of deep dive content is your thing, make sure you're subscribed, because we're about to get into some of the wilder theories floating around online and why most of them fall apart under real scrutiny. Now, let's talk about where the internet ran with this story, because you've probably seen the headlines already. The moment word got out that an AI had found hidden patterns in the Moai, certain corners of the internet jumped straight to ancient aliens. The claim goes something like this. The statues are astronomical markers built by an advanced civilization, possibly guided by beings from beyond Earth, and the alignments prove humans back then couldn't have figured this out alone. It's a compelling story. It's also not what the actual research shows. Mainstream archaeologists are united on one point, the level of sophistication on their own. Polynesian navigators crossed thousands of miles of open ocean using nothing but stars, currents, and bird migration patterns to find islands smaller than a grain of sand on a world map. A civilization capable of that kind of navigation was more than capable of tracking solstices and mapping freshwater sources without any outside help. What the AI actually revealed is arguably more impressive than any alien theory, because it gives credit exactly where credit belongs, to the ingenuity of the people who actually lived there. The patterns, Grok awareness, and long-term planning that most people never associated with a small, isolated island society. These weren't primitive, builders randomly dragging rocks around. They were engineers, astronomers, and resource managers, all rolled into one culture, working with nothing but stone tools and generational knowledge passed down by word of mouth. Let's talk about the transport mystery too, because it connects directly to this bigger picture. For over a century, researchers debated how these multi-ton statues move from the quarry to the coast. Some early theories involved wooden sledges, others involved log rollers. For a long time, mainstream science leaned toward the idea that moving the statues required cutting down massive numbers of trees, which some researchers linked to the island's dramatic deforestation and later population decline. This became known as the ecological suicide theory, the idea that the Rapa Nui essentially destroyed their own environment, chasing a religious obsession with statue building. But more recent research has pushed back hard against that narrative. A detailed study analyzing nearly 1,000 Moai, with a close focus on 62 statues abandoned along ancient transport roads, found something remarkable. The statues weren't dragged on their backs using sledges and log rollers at all. Their design, specifically their center of mass and the forward lean built into their base, suggests they were transported upright, rocked side to side in a walking motion. Researchers actually built a full-scale replica weighing over 4 tons and tested this theory in the field. With a team of just 18 people pulling ropes in a coordinated rhythm, they walked the replica statue over 300 feet in under an hour. It worked. It matched Rapa Nui orally tradition, which has always claimed the statues simply walk to their locations on their own. This finding matters because it directly challenges the idea that building the Moai required reckless environmental destruction. If the statues were walked upright using ropes and teamwork rather than dragged across log rollers requiring endless timber, the resource cost drops dramatically. It suggests the Rapa Nui civilization wasn't careless or self-destructive. It suggests they were resourceful, engineers who solved an incredibly difficult transportation problem using minimal materials and maximum ingenuity. That story lines up much better with what the AI analysis is now suggesting too. A society that thought carefully about resources, geography, and long-term sustainability. Not one that carelessly wasted everything chasing stone giants. So when you put these two pieces together, the walking statue research and the AI's landscape pattern analysis, a much richer picture starts to form. This wasn't a culture obsessed with monuments for the sake of monuments. This was a culture using monumental architecture as a multi-purpose tool, spiritual, territorial, agricultural, and astronomical, all encoded into a single design. The Moai weren't just honoring the dead. They may have been functioning as a living, physical archive of everything the Rapa Nui people needed to survive on one of the most isolated islands on Earth. Now, it's important to stay grounded here, because even the researchers behind the AI analysis are being careful about how far these findings can be pushed. As of now, no formal archaeological excavation has confirmed the specific relationships the AI identified. What Grok produced were new hypotheses, not proven conclusions. That distinction matters enormously in real science. The AI didn't discover a lost city. It didn't uncover a secret civilization hiding beneath the island. What it did was scan an enormous volume of existing data far faster than any human team could, and it flagged patterns worth investigating further through actual fieldwork, excavation, and peer review. Headline: We are entering an era where artificial intelligence can act like a research assistant, with superhuman pattern recognition, working alongside archaeologists instead of replacing them. Imagine every unexcavated site on Earth getting this same treatment: satellite data, ground surveys, and positional records all cross-referenced by AI, generating leads that human researchers can then verify boots on the ground. Easter Island might just be the opening chapter of a much bigger shift in how we study ancient history. It's also worth understanding just how much skepticism exists inside the scientific community, because not everyone is convinced this AI breakthrough is as significant as social media makes it sound. Plenty of archaeologists have spent entire careers studying Rapa Nui, and many of them are cautious about handing too much credit to a chatbot. Their concern is reasonable. Pattern recognition software can absolutely spot correlations in data, but correlation isn't causation. Just because two statues share a similar orientation or sit near a similar elevation doesn't automatically prove the builders intended some grand interconnected system. Critics argue that humans are naturally wired to see patterns everywhere, even in random noise, and that an AI trained on human-generated data can inherit that same bias. This is exactly why the researchers behind the Grok analysis were careful to describe their findings as hypotheses rather than conclusions. Science moves slowly for a reason. Every AI-generated pattern still needs to be tested against physical evidence in the ground, not just pixels on a satellite image. That said, dismissing this research entirely would be a mistake too, because AI has already proven itself valuable in archaeology elsewhere on Earth. Researchers have used similar machine learning models to identify buried structures beneath dense rainforest, canopies in Central America, spotting the outlines of ancient roads and plazas that would have taken human surveyors decades to map on foot. Other teams have used AI to scan satellite imagery of the Egyptian desert, flagging potential unexcavated tomb sites based on subtle shifts in soil temperature and texture invisible to the naked eye. In each of these cases, AI didn't replace archaeologists. It simply gave them a faster, smarter way to decide where to dig first. Applying that same approach to Easter Island isn't some wild leap of faith. It's a natural extension of a tool that keeps proving its worth across completely different corners of the ancient world. Let's rewind for a moment and talk about how dramatically Rapa Nui's story changed once outsiders finally arrived, because it adds important context to everything the AI is now trying to reconstruct. When Dutch explorer Jacob Roggeveen became the first European to spot the island on Easter Sunday in 1722, he encountered a population that was already living very differently from the civilization that had originally carved these statues. By the time British navigator James Cook visited decades later, the population had shrunk even further, and many Moai had already been toppled, some by rival clans during periods of internal conflict, others by natural erosion and time. Diseases brought by European contact, combined with the brutal Peruvian slave raids of the 1860s, devastated the population even more severely, wiping out much of the generational knowledge that could have explained the statues firsthand. This means researchers today, whether human or artificial intelligence, are essentially reconstructing a puzzle after most of the original puzzle box got thrown away. Every fragment of data recovered from stone, soil, and satellite becomes exponentially more valuable because so much oral history was lost forever. This context also explains why so many competing theories exist in the first place. Without written records from the original, researchers have had to rely almost entirely on physical evidence, oral traditions passed down through generations, and educated inference. That's an incredibly difficult foundation to build certainty on. It's part of why earlier theories, like the ecological suicide narrative blaming the Rapa Nui themselves for their population decline, dominated the conversation for so long, even though newer research increasingly points toward European disease and slave raids as the far bigger culprits. The Moai became an easy scapegoat in a story that was actually much more about colonial contact than reckless resource management. AI analysis adds yet another layer of nuance to that ongoing correction, showing a civilization that planned carefully with its environment rather than one that destroyed it, chasing statues. Let's also address something people often overlook when talking about the Moai, which is just how much these statues still surprise us even now. In March of 2023, volunteers restoring marshland after a grass fire uncovered a previously unknown Moai in the dry lake bed of the Rano Raraku crater. It had been hidden for who knows how long, buried in what used to be a small lake. Then, in August of 2025, another Moai emerged from the same drying lake bed, roughly 5 feet long, surprising researchers who genuinely believed the island's statues had already been fully cataloged. If new statues are still being uncovered after centuries of study, it raises an obvious question. How much are we still missing? And if physical discoveries are still happening in 2025, imagine what digital and AI-driven discoveries might reveal next. There's also the mystery of the pukao, the massive cylindrical stone hats placed on top of some moai, carved from a different type of red volcanic rock. Some of these top knots weigh more than 10 tons on their own. Several have been found scattered far from the statues they presumably belonged to, and nobody has fully explained how they ended up there or how they were lifted onto statues that already stood over 20 feet tall. It's yet another layer of engineering complexity that this island society solved without a single piece of modern machinery. Show an entirely different artistic tradition existing alongside the massive stone giants, suggesting Rapa Nui's spiritual life was far richer and more layered than a single style of monument could ever capture. Museums and private collectors around the world still hold these smaller pieces today, and their exact ceremonial meaning remains almost as debated as the Moai themselves. It's a reminder that Easter Island's mysteries extend well beyond the statues most people recognize from postcards and documentaries. So where does this leave us? The Moai were never simple decorations. They weren't random acts of religious extravagance either. Everything we're learning, from the walking transport method to the AI-identified landscape patterns, points toward a highly organized, deeply intelligent society that used every available resource, spiritual, physical, and environmental, with remarkable efficiency. GROK's analysis didn't hand us a finished answer wrapped in a bow. Instead, it handed archaeologists an entirely new set of questions worth chasing, backed by data patterns humans alone might never have spotted. The statues themselves haven't changed. They're still standing exactly where they've stood for centuries, facing inland, watching over an island that still guards more secrets than most people realize. What has changed is our ability to actually listen to what they might be telling us. And honestly, that might be the biggest takeaway here. We spent hundreds of years assuming we'd basically figured the Moai out. Ancestor worship, mana, done. But the moment we applied a new kind of analytical tool, entirely new layers of complexity appeared almost instantly. It makes you wonder what other solved mysteries around the world are actually hiding patterns we simply haven't had the tools to see yet. Stonehenge, the Nazca Lines, the pyramids at Giza. If AI can pull this much new insight out of data that's existed for decades on Easter Island, what happens when researchers point the same tools at every other ancient site on the planet? We are genuinely at the start of something big here. A moment where cutting-edge technology and ancient human ingenuity are forcing us to give our ancestors a lot more credit than we used to. The people of Rapa Nui didn't need alien help. They didn't need modern machinery. They needed observation, patience, community, and generations of accumulated knowledge. And they built something that still leaves scientists and AI systems alike scrambling to fully understand it hundreds of years later. Of human ingenuity, separated by hundreds of years, are now working together to answer the same fundamental question. Who were these people? And just how much did they truly understand about the world around them? Every new data point suggests the answer is far more than we ever gave them credit for. If this video opened your eyes to just how much we still don't know about the ancient world, do me a favor and smash that like button, and make sure you're subscribed so you don't miss the next deep dive, because we've got a lot more mysteries just like this one lined up. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.